couple of weeks ago, Lisa and I my wife, we were cleaning out a closet in our hallway. In the last couple of months, we've been kind of on a roll, organizing, cleaning, decluttering, and I love to organize. Like I can't fix anything, but I can see where things go, and so I love doing that. And there's two shelves in our hall closet that have all our medicines and first aid kind of things, and we had quite a bit going on those two shelves. So we took those completely out, set them on a card table, and just started going through each of the medications, each of the medicines one by one, looking at the expiration date, determining if we still needed this, didn't need this, and I started reading them. I thought, this just expired 2005. And this one expired 2008, and this one 2015. And I told Lisa, I said, I actually thought we did this like 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. I've lost time, but I know at some point I thought we had already done this. So why do we still have one that's expired in 2005 and 2008? And Lisa and I both wear some combination of glasses, contacts, readers, whatever it is we're choosing in a moment. And she reminded me we didn't use our readers that time. And we just kind of held it out and took a stab at it and said, I think that's good, and then we keep it. Well, that's fine. But if there was a day where we would have gone back, not been able to see clearly what the expiration date, and taken that medication, there's at least the potential maybe that there'd be something dangerous that would happen because we did not see clearly what those expiration dates were. And we want to think in these coming weeks of how we can see clearly through the lens that God has given us in His Word. And it's easy for us to look in other lenses and sometimes not know that we're actually looking through a different lens. Sometimes we know we're looking in a different lens, but we just want to ask ourselves afresh in our cultural moment, what is the lens through which we're seeing reality? And whatever lens we're looking through, that will tend to be the way that we live. This is crucial in our day to understand these lenses. Another way to think about lens is worldview. And the question would be for each of us, what is our worldview? And every one of us in the room and online, we have a worldview. It is a way that we see reality, a lens. And there are a number of worldviews that we could consider. Depending on what your thinking and background is, you might think immediately about world religions. And that is a lens through which people view reality. It could be Islam. It could be Hinduism. It could be Buddhism. It could be Christianity. You could choose any of the world religions, and that's a lens through which people see reality. Now, as far as the Christian lens goes, there are a number of ways that people vary from it and still think it's Christianity. One particular term that we could think about that started being used years ago is moralistic therapeutic deism. It's a lot of big words. Moralistic in the sense that people believe, yeah, there should be some kind of morality and way that we live in a good way. Therapeutic means that the way God has designed this is for me to be happy and to feel good. And then deism acknowledges there is a God that exists. And the only time we really need God is when there's a pain point and we need Him to fix that pain so we can be happy. Moralistic, therapeutic deism. The problem is, it sounds good. It's not Christianity. And then there's another lens or worldview that would be materialism. And materialism just says there's no God. And once you adopt that lens, then there's a number of ways that you replace God different lenses. One of those lenses might be feelings. That the way I see reality is through my emotions and my feelings. It might be the way, if I rule God out, that the way I see reality is through a sexual identity. That everything is seen through the lens of sexual identity. It could be that because I see there's no God, that I see through a lens of science. That's the way I see reality. Don't get me wrong, science can be good. It's just not a good ultimate lens to see reality. There's the express individualism today. That's a lens through which some of these things flow. And it carries with it the idea of follow your heart, you be you. Those sound good, the best version of yourself. Those are not Christian. That's a different lens. And often what happens, it's not just one lens people look through. They've mixed a number of these lenses. It's like, I don't know about you and how often you go to the eye doctor, but when we go, as a norm, I think this is normal that you do there. You get your head in this thing and they stick it against your forehead and your eyes are right there and they're making you look at the wall and then they're flashing these things and they're changing the letters and say with your left eye, you're covering one eye and then you're doing this and, is that one better or is this one better? And then it goes back and forth. I get so confused. I'm really trying to do it right because I want to get it right. And I think, I don't know. Can we do that again? It's too, but it's a lot of different lenses. Some are not as blurry as others, but sometimes that's the way we see life. We look through a number of different lenses and combine these worldviews and these lenses. We might look at this and think, this is a problem outside the four walls of the church. This idea of worldview. And are we holding a biblical, Christian, God-centered worldview? But I want to give you a picture that I showed at our budget meeting of 50 houses. And I'm ballparking statistics here. They're in the hunt. But imagine where you live right now. And whether you live in an apartment, a condo, a townhouse, whatever it is, 50 of those. And statistically, what we would know today is that 10 of those houses actually have people that are saying they're following Jesus. 10 out of 50. Statistically, what we know today, and this is the part that makes this so crucial, is that one of those 10 households that says they're following Jesus actually hold to and live a God-centered biblical worldview. 1 out of 50. If you're living a God-centered biblical worldview, you're not only the minority in our culture, you're the minority in your own church. Now, I didn't have time to do the math, but I suspect I'm in the hunt. What that would mean is, of everyone gathered here today, let's call it probably the first 4 rows here, that would be the number of people among us that actually hold a God-centered biblical worldview and are looking through that lens to reality. So we want to spend some time thinking about how to know what those worldviews are that other people have, what lenses they have, and what is our lens? What at the end of the day, really is the lens through which we're viewing things. And I believe that if we end up following the lens that is a God-centered, biblical lens, that we will be a people who are the most satisfied, the most joyful, have the most peace, and the most hope. And I want us to take a look today from an overview in the book of Daniel. It's in the Old Testament, and I want to look at these guys as a way to encourage us in how we can live in this world today. And my hope would be that when we're done with this and as we're moving through it, that we not only be equipped well, but that our love for God and our awe of God would increase. And that our love for other people would increase and overflow as our love for God increases and overflows. The way I want to think about these next few minutes is, how do we live as strangers and exiles in this world? Peter, in the New Testament letter of 1 Peter, starts it by saying that they are strangers and aliens and exiles in this world. So early on in our Christian faith, the early followers of Jesus were considered strangers. And I don't know about you, but as we look at how the last several years have unfolded, when that which once was moral and what we considered immoral is now actually considered moral, that which we once considered bad is now considered good, which, by the way, in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, it says exactly the same thing. So this isn't necessarily new to our day. I think it just spreads really fast with the kind of access we have to information. But we could easily today feel like, depending on what your morality is and what you see as good, we could easily feel like exiles and strangers today in our world. Can we flourish as exiles and strangers? And I say yes. And I want us to look at Daniel and his friends to see how we can best flourish in these days, and then as we prepare and equip so that we can live well in this world. We'll start in Daniel chapter 1, and this takes us back into the 500s BC. Actually, about 605 BC is where we get started, but this whole period of time will cover most of the 500s BC. At the time, Babylon has become the world power, and they are taking over places everywhere as the world power. God has been telling his people, you can either keep following the idols and keep treating each other poorly, and you're going to face judgment, or you can repent and follow after me, and then you'll be safe from that judgment. They repeatedly refuse, and what they say again and again, their false prophets keep saying, no, the finances are good, everything's good, peace and safety, everything's safe, everything's peaceful, financially we're good, everything's good. That's what the prophets would declare. And God said, no, it's not good. It's not good. So judgment comes by way of Babylon on the southern half of Israel, which is Judah. In 605 BC, we find that the way they started to deport those who were in Israel, the young adults were chosen, and the best of the bunch. It was the 18, 19, young 20-somethings, and it says in the first part of Daniel 1 that those who were youthful, good-looking, intellectual, these were the first ones taken and brought into Babylonian exile. So they're removed from the place where they grew up. They're taken into a place, and when we think of Babylon, just think anti-God. And I don't think it's an unfair launch forward to say that perhaps if we're not already living in Babylon right now, we're certainly well on our way. They're taken out of where they lived, where they could easily follow their God, and they're brought to a place that's anti their God. Nebuchadnezzar says, look, here's what we're going to do. Not only have I moved you from here to here, now we're going to educate you in a 3-year training program in the ways of Babylon. Now, our education shapes us. Whatever we're reading, whatever we're consuming with education, that is shaping our hearts and minds. So they're going to reshape the hearts and minds of these young men from Judah. And then he changes their names to names that reflect Babylonian gods. So we're going to change your name. We're going to educate you in the ways of Babylon. We're going to move you out of where you're comfortable into a place that's really uncomfortable. Strangers and exiles. And then we pick up in verse 8 of chapter 1. I want to think about this part of Daniel when we think about how to journey well is being anchored. Several of us met with Brandon Smelters. Many of you know him. He was very helpful to us in thinking how to do this series on worldview lenses. I've also leaned into Alistair Begg in his book, Brave by Faith, about Daniel, and I found it incredibly helpful to think through. Most of the time when I'm teaching, I'm just passing on how I get taught. And so as we look at this, we talk about what did Daniel do, and I love what Alistair Begg said. It's not Daniel and his friends we're looking to. It's the God of Daniel and his friends that we're after. It's their God that we're after, not them. But we see what God did with them starting in chapter 1, verse 8, and we see that Daniel is anchored to his God. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel in verse 9 favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. I want us to lock in on verse 8 to that little phrase, Daniel made up his mind. Now, Daniel and his friends, they were okay with, like they didn't really have a choice, but they had been relocated now into Babylon. They weren't resisting the 3-year education plan. They took on the names they were given, but at this point, he drew the line. He made up his mind. The word there is resolve. He had a resolve. Now, why did he draw the line at the food? Well, to the Jews, the way they did their diet was crucial to their faith. And Daniel was not going to allow that piece of his identity to be removed. So that's where he held his ground. He resolved, made up his mind. He requested that he just be able to eat vegetables, his friends eat vegetables, water. And the guy that was in charge of him, he was a little concerned because if he messed up with these guys, they end up looking worse than everybody else, then that's trouble for him. So it's like a job security thing. And he says, he finally capitulates, gives in. And 10 days later, we find in verse 15, at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. He made up his mind, resolved. Now, the idea of Daniel chapter 1 is not a diet plan for the 21st century. And besides, if it was a diet plan, they got fatter. They didn't lose weight. So this isn't about the diet, it's about being obedient to his God. In verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. God is the God of all knowledge, the God of all wisdom, and God gives knowledge and wisdom the amounts he desires to each person the way he desires to use it. God is the one that gave them what they had. But Daniel made up his mind. He was resolved. I want to ask you as our church, and if you're considering this being your church, I might ask you, would you join us with a resolve in the coming days to work hard and to fight for what it means to be a follower of the God of Daniel? Now, we're sometimes scared to talk about working and fighting because of the way that's going to be heard. Jesus did the work for us on the cross for our salvation. We cannot work for our salvation. It is his grace, and it's stunning that he would do that for us. Once we believe that, Paul writes in Colossians 1 and says that he labors according to the Spirit. Now it's the Spirit of God in us that labors through us. Will you be willing to work and labor in the days ahead to really understand what a biblical worldview is, what that lens is, what other worldview and lenses are, how to figure out what that is in somebody else, and how to graciously have a conversation with them once we understand it. But it will require work and fighting. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul uses this language. He's writing to a young Timothy. He said, hey, if you're going to follow God, this is what it looks like. A soldier who's willing to suffer and doesn't get entangled in the affairs of everyday life. For those of you who are in the military, you understand it. That you need to prepare, work hard, train. You have to be ready for the most dangerous of situations. And if you're not ready, that's bad news for everybody else with you. It's no different in our Christian life. If we're not trained, prepared, ready, then somebody in our family is going to pay a price. Some of our friends are going to pay a price. So as a unit, we're called soldiers. And then he goes on to say, we're like farmers who work hard. You know any farmers? They get after it. It's hard work. It doesn't just happen. They're dependent on God ultimately, and God has designed them to work. Somebody sent me a podcast the other day of a pastor, and man, he challenged men like nobody's business. And I thought, I'm going to pass the challenge on. And what he said was, he's looking at men and he said, you're going to have to be willing to fight. Not fight other people. You're going to have to fight to spend time alone with God in His Word. You're going to have to fight to make sure you have that time. It's not easy. Anybody think it's easy to get in God's Word every day and to be stable and firm in Him, to study God? No, it takes work. And you're going to have to fight for it. And I just want to challenge the men at 121. And this is such a weird day because it's like if I challenge the men, I've diminished the women. And that is not what I'm doing. Every person in the room, man and woman, is of great value and dignity and worth. And God has given us roles. And He's given men the role to lead in their home. And ladies, I'm going to talk to our men because I love you. Because when the man's got it going right, the home tends to go right. I'm not saying a lady can't lead, a mom can't lead. I'm not saying that. I'm just challenging the men to get in there and fight. And to get in there in God's Word. And to get in there and study. This guy, when he was talking the other day, he said he listened to a pastor that quoted a lot of Scripture. And as he listened to him, he told that pastor later, he said, you have such a gift for that. And he said, I couldn't do that. He goes, no, I just work harder than you. He's right. Are we willing to work hard to know God, to know His Word, to fight for the time? I'm telling you, your families are at stake today. Men, your families are at stake. Will you fight as hard to have a resolved mind in the God of Daniel as you will to make sure that every kid gets to practice this week, finishes their homework, makes their 8 tournament games? Will you work that hard to make sure that in your home that you're not leaving your kids and your wife defenseless when they walk out the door? But you're going to have to fight for that. Now, I was challenged to, a lot of times we tell men to lead, that we don't tell them how. Look, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I didn't know how to be a dad, to raise sons in a Christian home. I started asking dads that looked like they were doing this well, how do you do that? I didn't know God's Word when I came to Christ. I talked to a lady the other day, and she didn't know anything about the Bible when she came to Christ, and she went to BSF. And I said, why'd you do that? So many people don't want to go to intense Bible study when they know nothing. And she goes, I was hungry, and I just went. See, you don't have to know anything. Just get in. There's all kinds of help. We're going to help in these coming weeks. It's not like do this and then go figure it out. We're going to help. But you've got to want to do it. You've got to fight for it. You've got to realize the consequences for it. Now, I'm going to be a grandfather, and so I see things with a different lens now than I saw a bit ago. And so I notice things that I didn't notice before. Did you know that there's 2 verses in the Bible for grandfathers? 2. Deuteronomy 4:9 is one of them. Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen, and they do not depart from your heart all the days of your life. But make them known to your sons and your grandsons. It's my job to fight, to work, to make known the ways of God, to live out the ways of God to my sons and my grandsons, our daughters and our granddaughters. That is our job. We have the same resolve as Daniel to lead in that way. Well, Daniel was anchored to his God. And when you're anchored to your God, you're able to lead this way. I was with a homeless lady the other day, and we talked for a while. It's a neat lady, and she knows Jesus. And we started talking about different things, and there's a lot of the areas where she's rebellious, and so she can't get into some different discipleship programs. But I said, you know what? You got to fight for it. I've kind of been on fight mode the last several days. It just doesn't happen. And she goes, you know what? I know that now. And she said, I wish someone would have told me that years ago, and I wouldn't be in the situation I'm in right now. Anchored to God, fight, work to be anchored to Him. When we're anchored, we're free. We turn to a different story in Daniel chapter 3, and I believe that if we stay anchored to God, then we actually have a freedom in God. Now, in Daniel chapter 3, we're going to talk about Daniel's 3 friends and what's going on there. Nebuchadnezzar's the king. He decides he wants to build this atrociously big image of gold, and then he wants everybody in the kingdom to bow down to it. And they're going to play a bunch of instruments, and once they play the instruments, then everybody is to bow. And in verse 6 of Daniel 3, it says, but whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Here's your choice. You can bow down to this altar, or you can be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Now, my guess is most people thought it was a bunch of nonsense. A guess. I don't know. But you know what? They probably decided, it looks like most everyone decided, okay, we'll do it. So they play the instruments, and everybody bows down to the big golden image. And I'm sure they were thinking, you know, if I do this, it's not going to cost me anything. I keep my job. My family will be intact. No harm, no foul. I don't really believe this anyway, but I'm just going to lay low. I'm sure there's some people that'll take this on, not me. Those are the kind of choices as a Christian today everybody's going to have to make. And are we going to go silent? Say, that really doesn't hurt anybody, not a big deal. Other people will take a stand on that. That's not real freedom. When we're anchored to God, we're free. Then we can stand firm. And 3 of my favorite verses in the Bible. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're kind of looking at this whole thing, and some of the advisors come and they tell on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar's furious, and that's what happens when people don't bow down to us. We get furious about it. So imagine these 3 guys from another country. They're exiles and strangers in this land, and now they're coming before the king, and the king is in a rage, it says. Like, it's not just I want you to do this. I mean, he's furious mad. And this is their response. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, Let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. Alistair Begg reminded me that in Exodus chapter 20, there's a list of commandments. These young men knew those commandments. And one of them was, you don't bow down and worship an idol. That's not what someone who's following God does. And they weren't going to do it. They were anchored and they were free in who they were in God. And I love what they said. We know our God can deliver us. He might not. We're okay with that. We're sure not bowing down and serving your gods. We're not going to do that. Well, enraged, and I don't understand why he did it, but he turns around and superheats the furnace to 7 times the amount of heat it already was, and I'm sure the heat was sufficient as it was. And instead, his guys end up getting killed because the heat is so intense when they take Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They place them in the furnace, and now they're in the furnace, and nothing's happening. And Nebuchadnezzar goes and he looks in, and he sees, and when he sees in, he says, there's a 4th person in there. There were just 3. Who's the 4th person? Well, they come out unsinged and no smoke on them, nothing. They come out clear. And there are different thoughts on who that 4th person was. It might have been an angel of God. It might have been Jesus, pre-incarnate Jesus. There's different thoughts on that. But the reality is that we are going to go through fiery trials, and we know with confidence that God will walk in those trials with us. These guys were unafraid. They were free. They were anchored to their God. When they came out, what did Nebuchadnezzar say? He didn't look at them and say, great job, guys. I love how you withstood the fire. Fantastic effort you put in there. No, he blessed their God. Remember, this story's not about Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. It's about their God, who they have a confidence in, who can deliver, and even if he doesn't, we're good dying because we're good in him. They were anchored, and they were free, no matter the cost. Now, we live in a culture today that has a real high value on safe. And don't get me wrong, there are a number of settings where we need to be safe. But can I also say that if you're going to follow Jesus, it's not externally safe. We're exiles and strangers in this world. Jesus said, they hated me, they're going to hate you if you follow me. Paul wrote to Timothy and said, indeed, all those who are godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. The question, and Elisa Childers has written a book and that I've been reading. She's fantastic on the worldview and apologetics issues. But the question we need to ask, if we are being persecuted some, is it because we're being obnoxious? Is it because we're being rude? Is it because of the way we're doing it? Or is it because of Jesus? And we can expect that people will not be interested in that. So what we do know is that our soul is safe. And that God will safely bring us home as being strangers and exiles to be with him for all eternity. There is a safety there. Anchored, free, unafraid. And we see that unafraid come to pass in Daniel chapter 6. We've seen it already, but we see it again here. Now we're 70 or 80 years later, and Daniel is probably in his 80s-ish. He spent his entire adult life in exile as a stranger. He has flourished in that space. And as we get to this part, Persia is now the world power, and Darius is the king. He recognizes Daniel in the work he's done and wishes to have Daniel over the whole kingdom under him. Well, that creates a jealousy. Here's this 80-plus-year-old guy, and he is getting all the favor of the king of Persia. So some guys are kind of jealous of that because that's the position they want. And the only way they can get him, the only way you can get men and women of integrity who live life well and above reproach is to get them at their God. And that's what these guys do. They come along and say, hey, why don't we do this? Let's have a 30-day period where if anyone asks any other god anything, or asks you, the king, or doesn't ask you, the king, then they'll be thrown into a lion's den. The king agrees to it, signs an edict, and in verse 5, we see the way they're doing this. These men said, we'll not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. And then in verse 9, the King Darius, he signed the document, that is the injunction. So this injunction's in place, that if Daniel appeals to any other god besides the king, then he'll go to the lion's den. Well, what does Daniel do in verse 10? Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Daniel had a rhythm of how he built his relationship and his confidence with God. And when that edict was passed, that injunction was decreed, what did he do? The same thing he did the day before. He kept that rhythm of prayer. Now, this week, I pray often that God will do things in our nation that would just cause people to be in awe of him. And it was encouraging this week after the horrific incident on Monday Night Football that so many people have gathered to pray. It's been spoken of again and again. Even last night, one of the football games, both teams came together and they prayed. And look what's happened. That young man that was in critical condition on Monday night, today, they say there's no neurological issues. He's talking. We've watched God answer yes to that prayer this week on a national stage. It's what Timothy Keller says, when there's still echoes of God inside of people. And that's hopeful when people realize, I am totally helpless. I can do nothing for this young man. And prayer is where they turn. I don't know who they prayed to. I don't know what they're thinking about. But at least there's something in there that said, I'm going somewhere else because that's the only way this is going to happen. And God gets glory for that. Not the prayers of people. It's the God of the people praying that's doing it. What is our rhythm? In these next few weeks, this is what we'd like to do. We want to connect what we do on Sunday in this teaching with daily time with God. One way we can be a help, we have these Table for Two devotionals. I don't know if I said it earlier, but oftentimes we're accused of saying men need to lead and we don't help them. I want you to know we're going to be helping. It's just a matter of if you'd like the help to get in the fight and do the work. And one of the ways we can do this, among many, we have these Table for Two devotionals, and we use that imagery because it pictures time alone with God, just me and him at a table for two. And we want to be at that time in the Word. We want to fight for that time. Well, our Table for Two devotionals will be tied to what we teach on Sunday. So what I'm doing this morning, it'll be tied to this week in the 5 days that follow. And then I just want to cheer, and I'm going to optimistically ask every person in the room, if you're going to be at 121, to get engaged in a small group community. All churches call them something different, but we call them life groups, God-centered, Bible-centered, building relationships with the looking through the lens of God and his scripture. And I just want to challenge and encourage you, if you're not in a group, we're going to be launching some new ones. There's plenty existing ones. There's 100 plus to choose from. But to get in a group so we can do this together and sharpen each other well. Our preschoolers and children and students are all doing the same thing. You'll get, probably some of you already have today, you'll get texts as soon as the service is over sometime of some questions to talk about with your children if you have kids in preschool or in the kids area. We're just working hard to link everything together so that we can really anchor into these ideas and to walk faithfully in that biblical, God-centered lens. And you say, well, okay, sometimes I don't know if I kind of get all this, so I don't really want to do that, or I've seen this or whatever. But here's where I would challenge you. I think we really have not. And here's why I say that. A guy challenged me about 3 years ago, and I thought, that hurt. He's right. And I may scare you off here, but I don't want to. I want our life groups to be real. And that we can really say what we actually believe and what lens we're really looking through. See, because to be honest, unless I sit and ask Mike, what? You don't have to answer. This is rhetorical. We hang out at times, so we're good here. I don't know what Mike really thinks about abortion. I really don't. I've never asked him. I have no idea. I don't have any idea what Paul thinks about race. I've never sat and had the conversation with him and let him talk, not let me share what I think. I don't know what Kelly, his wife, thinks about gender. I've not sat and had a conversation with her. And I would say you might be stunned what people that you've been doing life with for a long time believe about really hard and difficult topics that are in our culture today. I've told our adult life group staff, if this isn't the most busy time being on staff these next 3 months, then we've done it wrong. If we can't stir up questions, I don't know if Andy believes Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life or not until I ask him. He does. He just acknowledged it. Good for you. It's a way to take a stand. Good job. But there are probably a lot of us that kind of think, I've got a lot of friends that are, some are Muslim, some are Hindu, some are this. I don't know that I really believe that Jesus is the only way. Could we have those conversations for real? I can't disciple you and we can't help each other if we're not honest about how we actually really see something. That's why I want you in a group. Let's do it. Let's do the work. Fight for it. Learn to have gracious conversation. We hear somebody say something, oh my gosh, I didn't know you thought that. No, have a little restraint. Let the fruit of the Spirit produce some gentleness and self-control. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about why you see it that way. And then let's have a really good, robust conversation around it. And let's see what God does. God's big enough for that, by the way. Sometimes we're not, but God is. And so we just want to get in, and we want to be in these regular rhythms of being in the Word and functioning in that way. Now, what happened to Daniel here? He gets thrown into the lion's den. Darius didn't want to do it, but he throws him in there. And then he's all night long, he can't sleep. He comes first thing in the morning and says, Daniel, did your God deliver you? I mean, even Darius knew it was his God that was doing all this. And Daniel said in 6:22, my God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth. Daniel didn't say, man, you should have seen me tussle with that lion. No chance. No, my God did this. So we're talking about the God of Daniel, and we can move with confidence and flourish in our culture when we chase after the God of Daniel, who is the God that is Jesus Christ. Now, I want to introduce you to these two ideas, and these are two grids we're going to work through for the rest of this series. And I just want to introduce you to it, and then we're going to work with it again and again and again so that we can learn to think biblically and God-centeredly and then understand how someone else is really thinking. Now, this is familiar to many of you. Some may not be, but this is God's story, a way to think about God from Genesis to Revelation. God is the center of everything. He's connected to His creation. Everything's in perfect harmony there. The fall to the right, that's when sin enters into the world. Now that's a broken connection between God and us. And now we're living in that fall And then there's this redemption possibility. We're connected back to God through Jesus. And for those who believe that Jesus died for all the filth and all the dirtiness and sin in our lives, and that he can actually rescue us from it, when we believe that, God writes us into a story. So now we're living on this side of the story. We're not just on this side. It's a broken world, but we're living redeemed in it. And we're moving towards the new heavens and the new earth when all things will be restored, all things made new. And that's incredibly good news. That's the story of the Bible. And we can move everything through it. Now, some of you are thinking, yes, you've said this to us again. I've got it. Well, my question is, have you said it to somebody else to know if you really have it or not? Have you shared it with your single friends? Have you shared it with your spouse? Have you listened to your kids? Do they have it? Have you listened to your adult children? Do they know it? Have you had that dialogue with each other around it? And then we're going to work through this. Every cultural issue today, we can run through this grid. It's not just about our salvation. It's how do we run through it. So an example, when I do weddings now, I mostly use this as a way to talk about the gospel. And I'll say at a wedding, you know what? God is the center of everything, not us. In creation, he created marriage for a man and a woman. He's the one. It was his idea. But things got broken in the fall. And the Bible says that women are going to try to manipulate and control their husbands, and husbands are going to try to rule over and do the same with their wives. That's why there's problems in marriages today. But you know what? Jesus redeemed us, and he changes our hearts and fixes that problem so that now I can actually serve my spouse, and because of Christ in me, he said there's a far greater thing at stake here, and that we're to be a picture of Christ in the church. We represent him in our marriages. And you know what? One day, while it's imperfect here, we're going to be in the new heavens and the new earth, and there's going to be the marriage supper of the Lamb, and it's going to be the most unbelievable marriage ceremony of all time, the greatest feast we've ever experienced. There won't be a reception quite like it. And Jesus, the groom, is coming back to get his bride, and that's what we're picturing. See, I want us to think through every issue, whether it be race, whether it be gender, whether it be gambling, whatever it might be, that we put it through that grid and say, are we thinking in a biblical lens, or have we allowed some other lenses in there? Now, how do we discern? It's the last thing. How do we discern other people's worldview? We ask these questions, and these questions actually tie to God's story. And again, we're going to come back to all this. But the questions are this. Origin. If I ask you what you think about origins, where we began, that tells me a lot about your worldview, your lens. The second question is problem. What do you believe is the problem with the world? And then the third one is, what do you believe is the solution to the problem? One guy told me at the time, he said, that the economics are the problem with the world. Okay, well, what's the solution? Well, he had a solution that went with economics. That's what he sees as the main thing. A Christian worldview says what? Somebody say it. The problem? Sin. That was with gumption. And then the solution, it's Jesus on the cross. Yes, good. And then the fourth one is purpose. If this is the solution to the problem, then what's your purpose in life? If I believe it's the economy, then I'm going to work really hard. My purpose in life is going to help the economy be all that it can be. And then the last question is destiny. What do you believe about things when we die? The reason we made that a funnel is if we ask those questions, by the time I hear your answers, I'll know what lens you're looking through and who your God is. And I'll know what your reality and your truth is. And then maybe we have a place where we can start a conversation and a dialogue at that point. I love, again, that we're part of a church where we can work hard together, fight in the right ways together, and chase after the God who's worthy to be praised and to be loved. Father, thank you for our time, and you're good all the time. And God, thank you for your word that gives us a strength. Thank you for these men, and more than that, God, we look at who you are as the God of these men that gave them an anchoring, a place to stay steady. You gave them a place of freedom so they wouldn't compromise, and you gave them a boldness to be unafraid no matter what came at them, all at the same time they were flourishing and they were doing well for the community they lived in. So God, help us to do the same. And Lord, I pray in the days ahead that we'd be strengthened where people are not believers. I pray, God, this will be a fun time just to kind of explore what that means and what different views are. And then, Father, I pray for those that are stagnant, indifferent, might have drifted, that you draw them back in, excite their hearts for yourself. And then, God, I pray for those who are strong and walking well, that we'll be able to mutually help and strengthen one another, God. So we look forward to what you have in store. And we just want for a moment to pause and be quiet and just see, is there anything God's saying that when we give ourselves to Him, I want to leave this place in obedience to Him, and I worship Him in my obedience. Let's just be quiet, and if there's anything God's saying specifically, allow that to really sink deep.